Hi everyone. I've got a little talk here about PWA and Magento. I'm not going to make this an introductory talk. I'm going to zoom into the technology itself. So maybe before I take off, how many of you are developers? Hands up. So that's nice. So that's like 99% or so of all of the hands. So that's perfect. Let me introduce myself for a moment first, before we actually head to the title of my talk, building a PWA with ... well, React and a question mark, because there's numerous solutions out there that could be used for building a PWA. But yeah, to start off, I'm Jisse Reitsma. I'm from the Netherlands. Well, I was about to say like, oh, it's really nice and warm here in Mumbai, but I'm feeling a little bit chilly because of the air conditioning. But this is the little town I'm from. Actually, it hasn't snowed for 20 years or so, but it's a picture from the past. About myself, I'm a developer for a company called Yerio, which is not a huge company because it's a one-man company, so that's me. I'm training people, I'm developing extensions. I'm a Magento Master 2017, 18 and 19. And while training, I also do a couple of other things like organizing conferences. And was actually not here on this slide, I forgot about it, but I've organized a developer conference called Mage Test Fest in the past. And also Reacticon, which is specifically focused upon front-end development. And there's a Reacticon 2020 coming up. And basically conferences, developer conferences, it's always a nice way to learn from each other. So this brings me also to India, and actually I've been to India in the past. So I'm still on a personal note. I've been going to India forth and back for, yeah, so this is my seventh time. I always keep loss of track. But in 2004, it was my first time in India, really as a backpacker, going to Srinagar even though all of the people there said to me like, you're crazy to come to Srinagar because it's dangerous here. Well, you know the story behind it. Afterwards, I did a couple of other touristic things. I ended up in Dharamsala, where the Tibetan government in exile is also there. I helped them out with PHP courses, JavaScript courses. So it was a lot of fun actually to train Tibetan monks even in programming. And then actually in 2020 there I am in Mumbai. And it's actually funny to see like all of those years, there's a lot of change in there. I started off personally with Joomla Virtuemart. And in 2005, I was really disappointed with that combination, but I still had to wait for a couple of years before Magento 1 actually came out. So it's not like a sum up of my life, but I just try to pick up those years and then correspond to them, like what happened also with Magento itself. So there's Magento 1.0, there's a couple of Magento events coming up. In the years, eBay took over. So basically there's a lot of change. And then, well, I yet got another third slide, even with years, because I just went online just to see, like, well, what happened actually in all of those years with technology, or specifically front-end technology. Well, there's Flash, and well, I picked up on Flash #1 in my listing because that's Adobe, and well, there's a specific story about Adobe that you well know. YouTube was introduced in 2005, something called Adobe Air was launched. I'm not sure if anybody ever developed something in Adobe Air. No, well, that's maybe also a point. So sometimes Adobe is also doing really successful things like Flash, and sometimes it's not doing that many successful things like Air. But in the end, a lot of change happened, and that's basically my main point that I wanted to make. Throughout the years, a lot of change was there, well, in my life, in the front end. And then the question would be, what kind of changes were there in Magento itself? So yeah, Magento got taken over by eBay, Magento got taken over by, or got purchased now by Adobe. So there's a lot of change on the business level. But I'm a developer. I'm much more interested actually on like what's happening to the technology itself. Which brings me to like this little picture. This is a car accident from India, so I looked it up. But it's not a Tato Nano, because I thought, like, well, Tato Nano is, to be honest, like a small car, and Magento is kind of complex, so it would have needed a Porsche or something really expensive to be crashed into something. But the picture tells a story, and I think like you get already part of the picture. If we zoom into the front-end technology of Magento, we can compare Magento 1 and Magento 2 to each other. In Magento 1, there was a lot of stuff going on with XML layout, PHTML templating, and as soon as you start with front-end development in Magento 1, this is familiar. However, if you compare the stack to Magento 2, front-end development, basically the terminology is almost the same, except for the JavaScript part. So on the JavaScript part, we could say that Magento 1 was based on prototypes Scriptaculous. Sometimes jQuery was introduced by extensions or theming vendors, and etc. And then Magento 2 simply has added knockout and require to it. But it's not a huge change. And that's kind of interesting. That's the story I wanted to tell, because in all of those years that I've been busy with Magento and Joomla in the past, all of those years that I was coming to India forth and back, actually not a lot of change happened within Magento, the front-end technology. And about Magento 2 front-end development, there's a lot of things that we could say well, we could say that it's great and it's wonderful and it's cost efficient, but well, I personally disagree with it. I tend to be pretty negative about the front-end development part. It's difficult to extend. Specifically, if you move into the UI components, which are based on JavaScript, they're really difficult to understand, especially the checkout. And every time when I mention the checkout, well, a lot of times actually people start to smile a little bit, like the checkout in Magento 2. Like this, right? And it's hard to optimize for speed, which is exactly the problem in a checkout as well. So there's currently a couple of people, Andrew Levine and Willow Mickman, and most likely a couple of others, trying to optimize JavaScript bundling and a couple of other features in the front end. And they're delivering good work, but it's still the main point that all of us, we have a hard time actually trying to optimize it. Forget about Lighthouse scores or whatever. It's just, it's a different ballgame. And that's basically leading to the last bit, and that is that it's outdated. And outdated means that basically in those 15 years, me coming forth and back to India and doing a lot of things with front-end development, Magento evolving itself as well, actually this problem was not solved. Magento 2 front-end development is outdated from the start. So that's a really negative story, and I'm just honest enough to share that with you. However, there's a promise. The promise is Magento 2 PWA. With a question mark and with a couple of dots, because now we zoom into the more technical part of my talk, zooming into maybe that is what is more important. And then there's this terminology called PWA, and there's a lot of shouting currently, and I'm maybe also responsible for that, because sometimes I'm referred to as the PWA guy. It's a hype. There's a lot of positive things about it. There's a lot of promises. It's a different approach. It's leading to a lot of confusion because people don't know what PWA actually stands for, and etc., etc. And this is basically the problem, because PWA is only about the technology, or basically a set of features that you can build in a certain type of technology. And that's the thing that we should talk about instead of just the marketing term of PWA. So what I always refer to is a new way of doing front-end development, which is leading to a new stack, which is maybe leading to React and maybe leading into PWA. But the main point is basically that Magento is orienting itself more and more towards GraphQL as an API, and that GraphQL is basically leading into the real buzzword, which is headless. Forget about PWA, it's all about headless. Headless is the real key, because thanks to headless we can create whatever front end we want. It could be based on JavaScript, it could be based on PHP, it could be based on Go or other languages. And specifically, if we deal currently with what is hot and modern in Magento, a lot of people choose JavaScript. And then zooming into JavaScript, you could use Vue, React, Angular. I'm not making it really specific yet. However, this is filling in already like a vision that Magento at least has by putting forward this GraphQL API and saying, well, the new approach is relying upon this GraphQL API so that you can build other stuff on top of it. The opportunities are, well, numerous. Offline shopping, which is always like a holy grail thing. But what I always think about is like, okay, then I'm able to make a purchase offline. So I'm sitting somewhere in a remote location, no connection to the web, and then I'm checking out the product, and then I'm paying, and then I'm paying offline. So offline payment is actually still impossible. You always need to be online in some kind of way of placing the payment. However, we could think about payments that are first placed offline and then actually synchronized with an online environment, and then actually the purchase is actually complete. And that's what we call offline shopping. Another one would be, well, new payment procedures, but also in general, the performance goes up. We get faster websites thanks to the usage of JavaScript, thanks to the opportunities offered by this headless approach. Well, there's also limitations, and one of the limitations would be no more Luma. So, to be fair, one of the reasons we always picked Magento 1 was because it was so easy to create a theme based upon another theme. So therefore, theming vendors made a lot of business. Theoretically, with Magento 2, that's still the same thing. And then, thanks to the Luma default theme, you can quickly modify things based upon that Luma theme or based upon the blank theme. But with PWA, it's different, simply because there's more flexibility in the front end. We're not talking about a single solution anymore. We're not talking about a single front end that is connected to Magento, but we're talking about multiple opportunities written in Vue, React, Angular, and so on. It's a limitation because we're not there yet. I'm coming back to that point later on, but I want to move forward into the technology. For instance, the technology of a React application. And a React app would be written in a local web development environment where you use Node, Webpack, a couple of other tools. Based upon that, you can build a React application. So this is basically the slide that you can use even outside of the scope of Magento itself. Once you get started with React development, all of this just becomes a thing. Slowly leaning downwards, you have React state management, or in general, there's a problem of state. Within JavaScript, you want to make sure that the UI is changing, but then if a certain card is slid in, then there's a little flag that you need to change in your application that the slide in effect has happened. And then if you slide out again, it needs to be toggled off again. And little things like that need to be managed in a controllable way, because we've got a lot of things changing in an e-commerce app. The card, the customer login, and etc. State management could be solved in multiple ways. Local state, local storage, session storage, the context API specifically to React itself, and there's a thing called Redux. And I'm just mentioning Redux here as one possible solution, because I'm not mentioning yet the best practices method, or I'm not mentioning yet the PWA built by Magento. This is just a typical approach. As soon as you dive into GraphQL, Apollo pops up, and then there's, in the case of Magento itself, there's a fully ready GraphQL API. Well, fully ready, it's not entirely ready. There's a lot of endpoints already in there, but some of the endpoints might be still missing, but it's work in progress, and it's reliable enough to actually build a React application upon. This is something that you could build yourself. All of the technology is open, the GraphQL API is there, so you could get started with this without an issue. It's a typical environment, but now let's zoom into what kind of solutions are already there in the market, and then wonder like how this typical listing fits into their approach. So leading from the approach that I just mentioned, PWA is a set of technologies, and the technologies are outlined in the way that I mentioned. But now if we move forward, the dots also need to be filled in, because headless is not just React. Headless could also be filled in with Angular or with Vue. So it's a little bit more complex, leading basically to choices. And that's the main giveaway that I wanted to give you guys during my talk. What kind of choices do we need to make? Well, I'm orienting this on a developer level, so I'm coming up with a couple of questions that you could ask yourself as soon as you're choosing React. And then within React, you're going to build a React app connecting to Magento using GraphQL. That's the common approach. And one of the questions as a developer that you need to ask yourself is whether you're going to use Redux or not. So there's a lot of online tutorials out there explaining how to get started with React development. They start with a Hello World example, then you build a couple of components, then there's sooner or later an Ajax call that you use, and as soon as you have a more complex application in React, Redux takes care of the most complex state management. Sneak preview. In a couple of slides, I will explain that Magento has chosen Redux as a state management tool for their own PWA. But it's a question. It's not necessarily something that we could or should do as well. It's an option. Because there's alternatives. There's also a thing called Apollo. There's alternative state machines. And basically there's a couple of things that you could do without Redux, and there's a couple of things that you could do with Redux. And it's just depending on what kind of application, what kind of e-commerce shop you need to build. Therefore, the problem is choice. It's not a ready-made best practice like always use Redux. No, it's a question that you should be familiarizing yourself with. Another question is Apollo or not. Often when I read tutorials on connecting a React app together with Redux to something called GraphQL like with Magento, then often actually this library of Apollo pops up. But there's alternatives as well. There's another company called Relay which is trying to do the same thing. And even there's options to do the things with Ajax without using GraphQL at all. For instance, using REST. So the funny thing is, like, there's a best practices path, but it's not necessarily the only path to create a fully functional PWA. Yet another choice that you need to make is what kind of server architecture do you want to have? And this is open to a lot of debate. So yesterday I met up with a couple of developers and basically every conversation led into new aspects of this same question. The main choice is basically, do you want to have a specific middleware layer or not? There's Magento, there's the JavaScript frontend, which runs in the browser. And in between you can put in a middleware layer, for instance, written in Node, but it could theoretically be written in a different language as well. And then the question is, what kind of addition, what kind of benefits does this middleware layer has to offer? Well, that's kind of hard, but the main point that I personally see is that, well, this middleware layer is making it more complex. However, the middleware layer is also making it more flexible. Thanks to the middleware, you can direct traffic from the browser into through the middleware layer to Magento, but theoretically the browser can also directly connect to Elasticsearch or to WordPress. So the integration between services is no longer something that you manage within Magento, but you manage it within the middleware layer, with a promise that if the middleware layer is a little bit less complex than Magento, the whole project is also less complex. It's a choice. I'm not saying that you should have a middleware layer or you should have no middleware layer, but it's one of those answers that we need to answer ourselves before we can actually move on. And then finally, the most interesting part is how do you start with the whole thing? So I mentioned React and I mentioned Redux, and those are tools available online, so you can download them and write your own first React component and start off with all of those tutorials connecting React components using Redux, using GraphQL to Magento and exchange data. And that's basically one of the things that I always recommend you guys to do, build it yourself. However, with all of the features that Magento ships it could be taking a little bit of time to duplicate all of that. So the more obvious solution would be to choose some kind of ready-made solution and just start off with that. For instance, PWA Studio. So I'm now like already 20 minutes into my talk, and now I'm suddenly first mentioning PWA Studio on purpose because it's just one of the choices, one of the things that you could choose for. And then the stack that you get with PWA Studio is Buildpack, a development environment, which is not that strange or not that far apart from the typical React development environment that you would get while following online tutorials. The React basics are needed. There's Redux state management. So specifically for the state management within the React app, Magento has chosen the Redux library to do so. They've also chosen Apollo as a GraphQL client, and so on. So now you can see basically that what I started with a typical React environment as an example, is now actually being made practical in the form of PWA Studio, which is a solution you could use. And well, hey, hooray, it's Magento, so we can use it. And then the front end and the back end are both based upon the work of Magento as a possible solution. I'm not diving into PWA Studio further. PWA Studio itself is just a collection of specific tools. There's a build pack which is basically helping you to run a development environment and just make sure that everything is smooth and up and running for you developing your own stuff. But then theoretically you take their Venya base theme, which is a combination currently still of theming logic, so a base theme plus a UI library, and this UI library is becoming more and more important in the vision of Magento. While there's also the Peregrine component library, and you could say that the Venue UI library are only about the output of the front end, the HTML, while actually the Peregrine components are much more about how to connect the app into Redux and towards GraphQL, so basically the underlying logic. And then there's upwards, and well, if anybody is able to explain upwards in a couple of sentences, then feel free. I'm not. It's a little bit complex, so I'm moving on because that's not the point that I wanted to make. The point I want to make is PWA Studio is just one of those solutions out there. Besides PWA Studio, there's also Deity Falcon. And what we could do is just zoom into the features and zoom into the choices they've made to compare basically Deity and PWA Studio. So PWA Studio is using React as a framework and Deity is using the same thing. So in that way, they're more or less similar. However, PWA Studio is not requiring a middleware layer, but Deity is. And suddenly this flexibility pops up. So Deity is introducing a node-based middleware layer so that you can connect your own PWA to Magento, but theoretically to other e-commerce systems as well. And for instance, Deity is currently also partnering up with BigCommerce, so competitor of Magento itself. State management is solved in the same way. But you can see that there's a difference, a main difference, and that's also one of the reasons why you should choose PWA Studio if you really want to stick to Magento only, or if you say like, well, I'm not sure about the future of Magento and Adobe, I might want to opt for Deity. Likewise, there's Scandi. Scandi is connected tightly to Magento, also because there's no middleware layer. They've chosen not Apollo, so that's a mistake in my slide. So is anybody of Scandi here in the room? Well, if so, I apologize. But they've written their own state management, basically looking at the Apollo library and just taking all of the benefits out of it, or just rebuilding it in their own way. There's Vue Storefront, suddenly written not in React but in Vue with a middleware layer. And then there's Duca. And I'm not sure, like, if you heard about Duca. Well, nobody did. So it's great news. I'm proud also to announce basically this whole thing. There's a new solution coming up called Duca. And it's a fresh new React, Redux, Apollo-based framework. It's including routing, lazy loading, a thing called call locking. So just to make sure that if you add something to cart, it doesn't happen twice. And there's a lot of nifty, cool features in it. There's pages for products and categories and CMS pages. And well, there's still work in progress, product options and configurable products and checkout, who cares? And now the main cool part is actually, it took me about 80 hours or less than 80 hours to complete. But it's also meant as an educational prototype. So don't expect me to finish it. And therefore the whole thing is a joke. Sorry. So I'm not introducing this as an alternative to the others. I'm using this actually to make a point. Last summer I worked 80 hours on this, and I was amazed and surprised how quickly you can actually build something like a shop with simple features and just get going with it. And that's not due to that I'm a genius developer. Well, it's due to the stack. That's my opinion. We're choosing React or Vue or theoretically Angular, not because the stack is complex, because we're replacing the Magento 2 front end as it is right now with something equally complex. No, we're replacing it with something much easier. And basically the 80 hours are illustrating that point. Every time when I'm training developers and helping them with the first steps into Vue and React, I always get the same reaction, as in, they're so amazed with how quickly you can prototype things and build stuff. That's the real benefit. And therefore I should ask you guys basically to take this into the equation itself. There's a learning curve with everything that you do. And that learning curve should start with something like a Hello World tutorial, then maybe in the perspective of PHP or maybe even JavaScript or other languages. Then you start playing with functions and classes, and then sooner or later there's object-oriented programming, and then sooner or later you're going to create your own CMS. And I'm not sure if anybody ever got to the last point, whoever created their own CMS? So few hands. And was it fun? And most likely you're not going to do it again, right? Well, the same learning curve is there with React as well, or Vue or Angular. So the first parts are creating a Hello World thing, following tutorials, getting into the basic stuff, and then sooner or later you're diving in deeper into the architecture with things like higher order components and well, Redux. And sooner or later I would encourage you to actually build your own PWA. Not necessarily because you want to have that in production, but because you learn so much from it. It's part of the learning curve to actually really conquer the whole totality of building a PWA with tools like this. So what I personally learned with Duka, I had to give it a name. So Duka means shop in Swahili. I don't know why Swahili, but well, internet, right? So you just Google around and then find this. So what I found was basically React is easy. Creating a React app is kind of easy as well. However, the more complex the app becomes and the more feature you want to add to it, then suddenly it becomes tricky. So I made a claim like, oh, I built a new front end for Magento in 80 hours. Well, that's false because it's still missing out on the most important features. If I would add in the checkout, most likely it's going to be quadrupling the amount of work, or to say the least. Likewise, the flow of data in Magento is also kind of complex. I've mentioned here the login procedure, so there's a whole procedure of fetching a token, validating that token, and then storing the token somewhere before you can actually log into something. And this whole procedure needs to be written somehow by yourself or by somebody else before actually a login is happening. And likewise with the checkout, and this presentation will be shared with you later on, and then the login has a link actually towards the Magento documentation explaining basically how complex but how doable also a checkout can be based upon GraphQL. The other point is basically following from the first point. It's time consuming. So it's fun to build your own PWA. It's maybe even fun to build your own front end for Magento, but just realize that there's a lot of time to put into it, a lot of time that you can learn from, but it's also basically something from a business point of view that you don't want to do. So more logically, you might want to rely on the work of others. And that's bringing back basically the slide that I had earlier on the PWA providers. So those other companies out there that already built a PWA, but also are offering this PWA or this headless approach as a ready-made solution so that we can pick it up and just take it from there. Also realize that the need of a community is also really strong, and therefore I'm just dropping Duka as well from the whole listing because, well, I don't have a community. Well, I've got one employee and he's a fan of Duka, but that's it basically. So a community of 2 is not enough to actually maintain a product on the long term, and that's why actually, to my vision, currently there's multiple headless solutions out there. If you explore GitHub, there might be numerous projects out there, but these are the ones basically to choose from. However, the last one is still build your own. And that's what I basically would like to end with. It's a new stack. It's based on either React or Vue, but it's just something that you have to learn from, and learning is the best way, or the best way to learn is actually to do it yourself. So building your own PWA is it's something that you could undertake, but just don't take it too seriously, and it might be better to actually rely upon the work of others. So basically be progressive and start playing, and I hope you like the little Magento image as well. Thanks for listening.